Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me introduce you. My name is Rina Anggraini. I'm a public relations in Paramadina University. It's a wonderful day to be a master ceremony in this beautiful day, 8th of Agustus 2019, in International Conference on Economic Public Policy and Development at Paramadina University. First of all, let's say thanks to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala has given us guidance, happiness, and healthy so we can attend and participate in this event. In this beautiful moment, I would like to say welcome to Professor Meredith Weiss from Albany State University of New York, Dr. Adam Taishan from University of Leeds, Dr. Ristu Konisi from Osaka University of Economic and Law, Japan, and Mr. Geradi Yudhistira as a moderator from University Islam Indonesia. Well, to take advantage of the event, at the time, let's start the agenda. Excellency, participants, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Mr. Geradi Yudhistira to the podium and moderate session 1. The topic is Economic Development and Public Policy. Please welcome to Mr. Geradi.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished audience. Let me introduce myself. My name is Kirani, and I'm assistant professor in Universitas Islam Indonesia, Jakarta. And I'm going to lead you for this discussion session for the next 1.5 hours with the 3 distinguished speakers. Yeah, I introduce you. The first speaker is Dr. Meredith Weiss from State University of New York. Please come forward. The second speaker is Dr. Adam Taishan from the University of Leeds, United Kingdom. Give applause. The third speaker, my friend from Osaka, sahabat saya, Mr. Dr. Tetsu Konishi from Osaka University of Economics and Law. Okay, the topic of today, this session is about economic and public policy. It's a broad theme, but I think the speaker will gonna break down the topic into the democracy, public policy, and specifically for the specific sectors. They will give a comparison with Indonesia and other Asian countries like Malaysia. Yeah. So I think the first speaker, I give the opportunity, this podium, for Dr. Meredith Weiss for talking about the public policy. I think the comparison between Indonesia and Malaysia.
Political parties, as political coalitions and parties largely are. Parties with clear platforms, distinguished, differentiated platforms, to which they can be held at least substantially accountable at elections. So accountability is not simply a matter for the courts, but also a matter for citizens to hold. Second, we might take the idea-generating process out of the political theater. Despite what I've just said about parties and elections and so forth, One of the key challenges for Malaysia's new government is one that Indonesia and really any state also faces: how to incorporate a range of inputs into policy development without careening either toward partisan corners or toward a sort of inchoate status pricing, just finding the minimum that will allow the ship to keep sailing, but that won't really make anyone happy. I have in mind here less a developmental state type of norm, that of insulating policymakers from political pressure, but rather finding ways to think about economic policy in particular outside the zero-sum framework of formal politics. Economic policy requires perspective. And the key step, I think, lies in fostering apolitical and preferably non-partisan think tanks, as well as developing academic expertise. Even apolitical idea generators cannot ignore entirely what is actually feasible, what might pass through the political process. But they may have a more expansive view of what's possible and a broader perspective. They're not seeking to get elected, but to define the best possible policy path. Malaysia has taken steps in that direction. Its new foreign policy framework, for instance, specifically references developing expertise, including by revivifying, bringing new life to organizations such as the Institute for Strategic and International Studies, or ISIS, in Kuala Lumpur. Moreover, proposals from Malaysia's, unfortunately still very few, policy think tanks, such as the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, IDEAS, or the corruption watchdog C4, they've found their way to policymakers. Those inputs have helped to shape resulting reform proposals. But Malaysia could learn a lot from the more vibrant community of policy-oriented think tanks in Indonesia, including, of course, INDEF, as well as from Indonesia's efforts to foster international academic research partnerships and centers of excellence across universities, which with substantive policy-relevant networks and outputs across a range of institutions here and abroad. That's an area in which Malaysia actually does demonstrably lag. So I hope there might be opportunities for mutual exchange and perhaps development of more regional think tanks and socioeconomically focused networks, especially given how similar many of Malaysia's and Indonesia's development challenges really are. Third, think beyond and below top-line economic indicators. So while numbers like GDP per capita make for a convenient shorthand, it's easy to compare them, it's easy to track them over time if you just look at the right statistical database. They tell us very little about sustainability or distribution. Both of those dimensions offer more useful ways to think about how best to design public policies for economic development. First, there's the broad issue of sustainability. Political sustainability, for something to be really workable, requires more than just boosting top-line indicators. GDP won't tell us political sustainability. Rather, environmental and social viability matter as well. Malaysia framed its agenda for policy development and economic development in terms of UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, even under the previous Barisan Nasional regime. But it does so more clearly now under the new Pakatan Harapan government. That was with the midterm review of what was the 11th Malaysia Plan, which is the current development plan, last year. And now, as Malaysia has just recently, I think last month, begun planning the forthcoming 12th Malaysia Plan. So SDGs, these Sustainable Development Goals, offer central rubrics and metrics, including, for instance, SDG 16, which is for good governance, or specifically to provide access to justice for all and to build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So even though this sounds like something that's more political and institutional, it really is foundational also to how we design economic policy in a way that will work. And that's why it's so central to Malaysia's plan. As the recurrence right now of the dreaded haze, particularly from forest fires in parts of Indonesia, makes clear, conceptualizing development in terms of social, political, and economic sustainability also requires thinking regionally. Malaysia suffers if Indonesia struggles, and vice versa. I don't think that either state has yet developed a fantastic formula here, so more coordination would surely help. Also recognizing where corporate, private interests align or diverge from state interests. Yet looking above and beyond the national level alone is insufficient. It's not just the regional level that matters, but also below. So a key lesson that Malaysia might draw from Indonesia is the value of decentralization and the dangers of fetishizing or focusing too much on the national or giving too much priority to the federal level. Questions of whether local governments should be elected again in Malaysia. They've been nominated rather than elected since the mid-1960s. Or of whether and to what extent resources should be redistributed across administrative tiers differently are high on policy agendas now in Malaysia. So in Malaysia, about 95% of resources of government revenues flow to the federal level and only about 5% to the state level among Malaysia's 13 states. It's fiscally among the world's most centralized federations. So this is an area where Malaysia could learn from Indonesia and where it's currently looking for other models. So Indonesia, though, also does offer warnings of what could go wrong, it's hard to say. So from the unsystematic proliferation of new administrative units eager to claim a budget allowance, to establishment of what are essentially local dynastic fiefdoms, to putting in place a system that simply requires an enormous stock of people who are already trained and have experience in planning and budgeting and auditing and all the other things that come with requiring that the local level have budgets and really work with them. So even the sheer number of elections to be conducted, as we know, may drain resources and public enthusiasm. It's really expensive and it's really difficult. But there's much to be said for understanding and approaching development as happening differently, with different key objectives, hurdles, and relevant indicators for assessment in different parts of the country, and incorporating meaningful civil societal input into agenda setting and monitoring to ensure last mile delivery or to ensure that all voices are heard is also likely to be easier at the subnational level rather than the national one. Fourth and finally, finding and creating new models is key, but without losing sight of core principles. The failures of the Washington Consensus are of course well known, especially in Indonesia, of all places. But other orthodoxy still carries a strong clout, some of it really stemming directly from the Washington Consensus as the earlier hegemon. It is perhaps in the domain of Islamist development and Islamist economics that Malaysia and Indonesia in particular have both space and impetus to carve their own path, and then to share ideas that work. So what is most important in declaring a developmental path Islamist or halal, in avoiding corruption and prohibiting usury and prioritizing fellow Muslim majority states as trading partners? So Malaysia has a lot of discourse of the Ummah and so forth, but its main trading partners are not among the OIC. So here, partisan politics may get in the way of logic and coherence. PAS leader, the Malaysian Party Islam in Malaysia, the leader Hadiah Wong in Malaysia, for instance, spoke through what seems a really starkly partisan filter recently, this was on the 20th of June, in suggesting that it's more important to, and I quote, prioritize faith before integrity, and justifying his party's alliance with a scandal-ridden UMNO. So that's clearly a question of just partisan politics. That is not something that derives from faith per se. So having another point of reference from Agustus may be useful in thinking through how to think about and pursue an Islamist model of development, especially as integrated within a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state and society, beyond that side issue of how an Islamist party might win power. That said, what is new, including among development models, tends to hold perhaps a bit more sparkle than is necessarily warranted. Technological fixes are a good example. So research from the US over the past decade or so has shown that yes, automating administrative processes, capitalizing on artificial intelligence and other advances, that does remove space for undue discretion, it makes government services more accessible and legible, and it otherwise offers real benefits and real efficiency. And yet, automation and the process of machine learning that allows that automation tends to encode human biases, while making the decision-making process seem neutral or from a machine, and obscuring who might be held accountable when something goes wrong. So automation is exciting and new, but it does have its own downsides. Part of what's necessary in economic policymaking is simply to assess and sustain what's working well, not just what some bilateral partner wants to fund. Yet, inasmuch as innovation remains helpful, where processes could stand to improve, there is space and opportunity for Southeast Asian models to diffuse across borders, alert, for instance, to the specific challenges of a large and diverse country like Indonesia. So to wrap up, Malaysia is currently starting along the path that Indonesia blazed 2 decades ago, of political reformation, and with an important economic development component. Malaysia is definitely lucky not to be buffeted by the same financial storms that made Indonesia's transition so much more difficult during the Asian financial crisis. But corruption was a key impetus in Malaysia as well. Most argue that that's what tipped the scales to allow Pakatan Harapan to win. And economic discontent is high. So inequality is high and rising, it's much higher than OECD levels. This is a problem in Malaysia. Political transition in Malaysia thus does need to include rethinking aspects of the country's development model and its priorities. Here, Indonesia offers guidance, especially in such domains as how to cultivate and deploy expertise, and how to reorganize planning and authority across administrative tiers, how to decentralize. Yet more broadly, this transition and the moment for institutional reform that it offers highlights an opportunity for cross-national and regional thinking about what objectives and what means to achieve those goals are most appropriate and most feasible here and now.
Thank you, Dr. Wei's fascinating presentation. The question is whether the quality of democracy of Indonesia right now will transform into the strong economic policy or the good quality of economy. So, for the second speaker, I invite Dr. Tyson to explain about his idea about public policy on oil industry. Tyson?
Thank you so much. Slight complication. Yeah, we will be using a slideshow. So a slideshow I don't have any control over, but I think we'll be able to coordinate somehow. Shall we do a system like a nod means keep it rolling, something like this? So who's in control? Okay, over here. Great. All right, so thank you so much. There's a little bit of crossover between our presentations, which is very fortunate. So I'll quickly give a 20-minute assessment of what I call the centenary challenge, because in Indonesia uniquely, goals are pegged to the year 2045 rather than 2050, which is typical of a lot of developmental goals. So centenary, of course, from 1945. And I'll be looking at palm oil production, which is a rather contentious issue, but we can, I believe, navigate a sensible path in order to have a reasonable discussion about palm oil production. And it will indeed tap into two concepts that the previous speaker raised, which are sustainability and but can we go to the next slide, please? I'll bring you to the United Kingdom very briefly, because I've just flown from there. Saya baru datang dari Inggris kemarin. So Theresa May, I think now we can say something good about her because she's finished. So in her final sort of big public event, she gave a speech at Chatham House in London, during which she made an appeal for a middle ground, compromised political discourse, which I think is a healthy approach to take on an issue like kelapa sawit, like palm oil production, because again, this has become a highly politicized topic. So in the spirit of Theresa May, who of course cited President Eisenhower, the middle of the road is all the usable surface. The extreme left and right are the gutters. And so we're aiming essentially for a reasonable middle road in our discourse today. Theresa May continues in our next slide, slightly more enthusiastically in one of her dance routines, that an inability to combine principles with pragmatism makes compromise very difficult, and we're going further and further down a road of absolutism. And to bring that to logic to our conversation today, we don't want to fall into the trap of a hardened stance. Either palm oil is good or bad. I'm a growth specialist or a conservationist. There is a middle road, and we have to find it and navigate through it in order to manage a massive, goal in Indonesia, which is to achieve a very high level of production by 2045. So that brings me next to the centenary themes that I'll touch upon today. Now, the context for this talk originates in the policy and planning processes of Indonesia, which are BPT PKS, which is the Plantation Management Agency's goal of 60 million tons of CPO by 2045 as a production target. Okay, very ambitious, very achievable, but certainly one that will have a massive impact, socially, environmentally, politically, etc. And one we have to take seriously. So given the 60 million ton CPO goal, I think we have to set that in the context of, at the same time, the National Development Planning Agency, BAPENA's Low Carbon Development Pledge. These two are problematic, okay? Achieving one compromises the other, potentially, if they're not managed well. And of course, also with the Indonesian general target of 6% growth per year, okay, running up to 2045. So this scenario, in my opinion, and probably very obviously, creates a complex hybridity of opportunities and challenges. And these opportunities and challenges we ought to give some thought to today. It requires, to speak to the themes of the conference, at minimum sound public policy, diplomacy, and innovation. And what you often see in the research institutes in Bogor and elsewhere are landscape approaches and evidence-based forestry as the sort of cutting edge and fashionable approaches to try to manage palm oil production while achieving low carbon development. Okay, thank you. So that's the general context. It's probably very hard to see this, but this is Indonesia's rough timeline. Now I managed to find a quote from a former Governor General of the Netherlands East Indies, who said, the cultivation system was the cork upon which the Netherlands floats, okay? It's a very telling pull quote, and I think it's still relevant today because, in fact, the cultivation system has evolved and changed over time, but what we've seen is essentially sugarcane to rubber to palm oil, a model of plantation economics that is very persistent and very, very powerful in Indonesia. Okay? And what's behind that is all sorts of interesting manifestations of local identities and the way in which people envision value propositions. So what is the value of a tree versus what is the value of 1 hectare that is cleared and cultivated? And these value propositions do change over time and in very interesting ways. And I've kind of mapped out and shown a big spike in palm oil production, which of course came on the back of the financial crisis that was alluded to, a bailout plan. I have the Candesis moment of when Suharto was facing his stern headmaster and lost a lot of public face. And now the transition to a dependency on markets in India and China, which are quite interesting. The next slide really captures all I want to do today, and I've probably burned up a lot of precious time waffling. But that red zone, if you can make it out, our speakers won't be able to, my panelists won't be able to see it, but there's a very critical red zone. That is the area that we're considering today. Because I've looked at the intervals within which Indonesia has made various production milestones, and in order to get to the centenary milestone of 60 million tons of crude palm oil by 2045, we're in that critical red zone, and various decisions will get us there. But I think it's important now to reflect on the potential consequences of different scenarios as to how you reach that milestone. I would also say, looking at the recent trends, particularly since 2008, you don't need till 2045 to reach that milestone. You'll probably get there much earlier, which means actually this conversation is even more important. It's not actually a centenary challenge, because given current trends, you should be there within the next 5 to 10 years, actually. But that will require a major sacrifice, in addition to the potential value added and the potential benefits and those the various distribution opportunities that come with it. So that red zone is where I think we ought to land. There has already been a WRI assessment as to what it would mean to reach that target. Now, under current practices, which is typically an expansionary model, so heavily based on land clearing expansion, rather than the intensification of yields per hectare. If you follow business as usual today, you'll need another 8.2 million hectares to achieve that production target, which is a very significant amount of land. Of course, the debate would be, well, is this what designation of land? Is it already degraded, in which case the environmental impact might be manageable? That's another debate, but let's just say, in most people who draw up scenarios, you don't want to have to clear and cultivate another 8.2 million hectares. There should be another way. One obvious approach is to improve smallholders, which are the fastest growing group of producers in Indonesia and probably the least understood, right, and the most diverse and the most problematic. So growth in small holdings and the contribution they will make to that production, that centenary production target, is very significant. And I think we have big information gaps about Indonesian smallholders. All right? The other is, of course, from big companies and large estates and plantations, those who are pledging to things like sustainable sourcing and traceability and using all the right language. That's easier to monitor and manage in a way. And you're seeing the kind of global pledges already coming from big companies who own and control large estates in Indonesia. But it's the combination of those two and the imperative of efficiency, which is something like 8.4 tons per hectare, which I think Indonesia is about halfway to that level of efficiency now. So a lot of research and work has to be done, and that requires investment. We've lost our images, but we can try to forge ahead anyway. Yeah, it's not really a big deal. The other centenary target has been analyzed by Bloomberg, and they've done a risk assessment. There's many, many potential risks along the way. I'll mention two. One is demand uncertainty. So India's demand has declined a lot, and China has stepped up and said, we'll fill that gap. But that's not altruism, okay? That's clearly China saying, you know, we'll import another, 500 million tons, but on condition. It's those conditions that we're not quite privy to, but are very important. The other is public perceptions of palm oil. I think this is also interesting because this is where we reach those antagonisms. Okay, this is where we upset a lot of people in talking about the negative public perceptions of palm oil. And yes, there are misunderstandings, but the truth is, and maybe someone from GAPI is here today, I'm not sure, to raise an objection, but the truth is, you give people, like certain members of the European Union, a very easy case to make that Indonesian palm oil is not produced in a very sustainable way. Now, whether that's real or not, I think doesn't matter in terms of public perception, but I think we're encountering questions around habitat conservation, sustainability, and distribution. Okay, really important concepts. I have an image here showing you Chinese delegation and their pledges to buy more Indonesian palm oil. The question I would raise in relation to the public perception is perhaps framed this way: apakah itu ketergantungan terhadap kelapa sawit? Is this a form of dependency? Because if you look at any major ASEAN Agri or Sinarmas or Sime Darby or Wilmar website, it's all about developmental opportunities, employment figures, and how wealthy smallholders are getting. Again, those are based on very general measures that don't reflect local realities, because in fact the local experience is very variable, okay, very different. If you go to Riau now, and you go to any kabupaten, you'll see that farmers get very different prices for the same yields, and in fact their experiences are extremely different. So we have to go behind those headlines a little bit, okay? And I would say, well, there's a lot of talk about opportunity and economic growth models, but actually this does appear rather like a model of dependency. And I think that's a point worthy of debate. If I have time, I probably don't. The recent Malaysian case of Minister Theresa Koh, Minister of Primary Industries in Malaysia, and her extreme reaction to a primary school play featuring children dressed as orangutan, and I think promoting the book that comes out tomorrow from Greenpeace, the Orangutan in My Bedroom, children's book, suggests that the battle for public opinion is still raging very strongly. I think the Malaysian reaction is a very negative one from this particular minister to lean heavily upon a school that merely had children, and I've watched the YouTube clip that went viral, nearly had children saying, if we don't produce palm oil sustainably, we're going to lose our ecosystem. It wasn't even saying stop producing, just said produce it in a responsible manner. And yet, the fire and fury of the minister came crashing down upon this school. What it at least did was spread the word that some schools, this is an international school in Kuala Lumpur, are actually challenging the mainstream narrative. So I thank the minister for extreme overreaction, because we all now know about this school. So it's good news in a way. I would also say that if you look at Dandi Laksono's Asymmetris film, if you look at Tempo magazine's, Majalah Tempo's coverage of the palm oil sector, there are real Indonesian voices holding the sector to account. This isn't just a conspiracy or a campaign hitam. It's not all about outsiders waging a trade war. There are real Indonesian voices saying this has to be managed well. Okay? If you look at slide 14, you'll see the images of the films that came out recently and the widespread media coverage in Bahasa. The next one is a very stern Theresa May, reminding us that absolutism gets us nowhere. And I think we have to encourage critical public debate about an issue that is a public interest issue for which everyone has a stake. And this cuts way beyond Indonesia's borders as well, right? And we talked about the potential of another dry season and more fire and haze in Riau, particularly in those peatland areas. This is a global issue, all right? So the critical points of view on the sector are not going away, I can assure you. And for Indonesia, you might as well engage directly with these, okay? Make your strongest case. I'm probably very short on time now, right?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. So let's fast forward all the way to, can you go to 19 quickly? Because we talk about where I think Indonesia needs to go from here. If you want to distribute, look at value distribution, the problem is Indonesia's locked very much into primary sectors, plantations, and mills, okay? This is the universal mill list. The unbelievable clustering of mills is concentrated in Indonesia and Malaysia. If you look next, Wilmar has plotted all of their mills and refineries. Their refineries are not here, really, okay? So, mill concentration, you bear the burden of that, that deep cutting into your environment, but the higher value-added activities are often, if you see, right there in China and India and elsewhere. So that's a problem. I mean, if you think strategically about how to address developmental issues, this needs to be rectified. Really quickly to the Simon Darby latest announcement of cross-check, which is, they say, great, we'll show you every mill in Riau, for example. And you can see right here, Dumai, that's your very active port, where all the crude palm oil of Riau is exported. Right next to Dumai, there is the Murni Sam mill, and it says green, no problem detected, except for the fact that that is a massive peatland protected area. Okay, so actually there is a problem. So it gets the green light, but no. So I like cross-check, but it's a little bit misleading, actually. And they have a nice overlaid graphic to show you where the peatlands are. So it's wonderful. It's a kind of lovely contradiction in terms. Okay, and lastly then, sorry, the last slide, bringing you right back to the CPO pledge. 60 million tons by 2045. The problem is, BPS, KPK, Kementan, they all have different figures. Do you have 12 million hectares, 20 million hectares? We're not really sure. KPK shows that you're not getting nearly enough taxation on these productive activities. And under current practices, we're going down a very dangerous path of more land loss, more environmental risk, and more health hazards down the road. So this needs to be taken very seriously. Riau is basically not the area for expansion anymore. I have the graphics right here to show. And then, sorry, I'll wrap it up right now. If you just go to the final slide. Yeah. right to the end, all the way, it's 2025. It's supposed to be a minute slide, that's impossible, to the last one. So just juxtaposing, is this really development? Final reflections, poverty relief is not the same as development. So this may be the cork upon which everyone floats, and it lifts people out of poverty, but that's not development, okay? It's very different. It may be a form of dependency. Certainly people are better off, but how long will that last? And what type of risk is there for especially smallholders? Does wealth spread laterally like a smoldering peat fire? Well, maybe, but again, there's a lot of risk. Then I'm juxtaposing the Tanoto fortunes with actually the ordinary life in Rio. And there couldn't be any more stark difference imaginable, okay? The Tanotos are the kings of Rio, right? And that is certainly a success story, but if you go anywhere outside of Pekanbaru, you're going to see a very different developmental landscape unfolding. So I do urge you to go and see it for yourself before you are a cheerleader for the industry. So it may be a great industry, but go see the actual reality on the ground for yourself. Okay, so thank you very much. Sorry for going over the
Thank you, Dr. Titans. We have passed 40 minutes, and alhamdulillah, no blackout today. Yeah, this is the energy problem that we are facing now. And hopefully for the next 30 minutes, no blackout also. Yeah. So the last but not least, third speaker from Dr. Kanishi, talking about, if I correct you, about the stock market and development in Indonesia. So give a call for Dr. Kanishi.
Thank you very much. Selamat siang Bapak-Bapak, Ibu-Ibu yang saya hormati. Saya dan tiba-tiba dan saya I would like to actually prefer to bahasa Indonesia, but here in the international conference I would like to use bahasa English. My presentation is about the stock market, but the perspective from political economy. Next slide, please. Next one. Actually, the stock market in Indonesia here is now slightly developed, and if you look at comparing this slide, comparing to the bank loan is slightly slowed down in terms of the in GDP share, and the stock market is slightly coming up. So next please. And actually, the Indonesian government have promoted the stock market. For example, there have been campaign of youth Nabung Saham since November 2015. The government target is 1 million individual investors. So actually, yang terbaru in 2018, there are 225,000 individual investors. So the objective of the government is more spread among the society to get into the invest, especially in stock market. Next slide. And actually, there have been development in stock market, but the development was cultivated by the foreign investors like Japan and US or Singapore. And but there, the foreign investors' concerns about their that there has been securing a minority shareholders' interest has been limited so far. So because of that is because of corporate governance issues. For example, the tunneling the minority shareholders' interest by each dominant big business families. And also, there has been so many non-transparent activities in the market. This is the last one is the main topic here. So next, please. And so IMF so far has viewed about the financial supervision as a especially the weakness in the legal and the governance framework has undermined investor confidence, and the absence of legal protection for the financial sector supervisors, so that the public questioning of political interference in supervisory actions, slowing down decision making and occasionally paralyzing the potential system. This is the IMF's view of financial supervision in Indonesia. And if you look at the political economic studies concerning financial supervision, there has been so many references about because Indonesia has experience in the financial liberalization in the 1980s, but Professor Rosser mentioned that it resulted in its hard way, and also financial governance failure brought the 1998 Asian economic crisis. Actually, the 1998 Argentine economic crisis was brought the financial governance was brought by financial governance failure. So some reform of the financial supervision was taken, led by IMF. But some researchers pointed out that still political intervention brought impediment to effectivity of the financial supervision. And also there are meanwhile there are some factors of non-transparency in the market. And here is I would like to bring to my awareness that please next one, whether financial supervision became more effective in the stock market before the upcoming digital era, because the digital era we can invest by using handy HP or smartphones. So it would be more non-transparent. It would brought some non-transparent transactions. So that my question is whether the financial supervisors are ready to get into this era. So actually, next please. Actually, I mentioned that the Indonesian capital stock market is developed, but if we compare to the other stock market in Southeast Asian states, the scale is the size of the market is very small comparing with Singapore and Malaysia. And so why? Next, please. And actually, the market capitalization and the number of the listed firms are increasing slightly, but still under development dibandingkan Singapore and Malaysia. we can see in the 2008, when the global financial crisis occurred, the index of the stock market and the market capitalization falling down because some possible, some major firms have failed. There are some rumors that some major group failed to trade spread among the market. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Next slide. Sorry. And there has been actually, you may know the Barclay Group's, one of the Barclay Group's shares dropped drastically, so that many foreign investors rallied out from the Indonesian market. So that, but then State Minister of Social Welfare, Mr. Barclay, has intervened to the market, and Sri Mulyani, then Finance Minister, stopped it stopped the seizing the restart, so that the transaction of Gumi share restarted. So and then Gumi Resources share price plunged to further, so that there is the big political intervention in the stock market. If we look at the banking sector, increasing non-performing loan after the 18th liberalization, there has been after the 1998 Asian crisis, there has been some frauds of Bank Indonesia's Bantuan Likuiditas Bank Indonesia, or some state banks too. In capital market sector, we can see actually the capital market is have a chain of regulations. So there it was expected. It is expected highly effective. Financial regulation is highly expected higher effectivity. A lack of transparency. And there has been so many problems that such as the lack of transparency of financial report of listed companies and illegal transactions, or political intervention, which I told you, that by the influential business groups. So my question here is whether financial supervision effective or not, and also including banking and capital market. But today I would like to present about the stock market. Next please. There has been actually after the neglecting lack of effectiveness of financial policy before the 1998 Asian economic crisis, there has been some discussion about the need of independent and integrated supervision in all financial sectors, so that there has been some resistance from Bank Indonesia because Bank Indonesia holds the authority to supervising the banking sector. Finally, after the 2008 global financial crisis, in this independent and integrated supervision as the supervisor has been founded, which name is the Financial Service Agency or Otoritas Jasa Keuangan or OJK in 2014. Actually, the law was endorsed in 2011. But if we look at the history of the financial regulation of stock market, we can see the next matrix. In the stock market has in Indonesia has a long history since in Dutch East Indies because Batavia Chamber of Amsterdam Stock Exchange is the origin of the here Indonesian stock market. And from after so you can see the right side is the financial regulatory mechanism in stock market. So OJK is the has the history to include the authority from other from finance ministry or Bank of Nations authorities. Next, please. And here is the I show this on this PowerPoint the rule of the legal framework of the rule of financial regulation. And here is the former OJK, his name is Padebam. Padebam is only for the supervising only for the stock market. And please to the next slide 17. I will skip here but even the OJK has all independency which were in the OJK law, but they say that the OJK's capacity has been unchanged because the OJK's budget depends on the large banks and personnel also succeeded the former Bank as one. But please skip until the 24th, please. Sorry, before the IDX has also the sanctions. OJK and IDX has the authority to sanction, give a sanction to the some illegal activities in the stock market, and IDX has some self-regulatory organizations such as the KASE, which is the Custodian Securitas Indonesia, and Trading Pinjaman Efek Indonesia, which is under the IDX. So IDX holds veto to clearance in the stock market. And I would like to show the case studies, but there's no time to show the case studies. But if I can, please next. Here is some uncertainties or non-transparency in the stock market, and these next slides can show some case studies. Please next, and there has been some cases. For example, the DJN National Gas Fund has a pipeline project, but there is some transparency. Next one is the Matahari Department Stores case. These are the insider trading, but there has been some effectiveness of the financial supervision. And next ones are the saham goreng in Bahasa Indonesia, or short selling in Bahasa English. And this is this transaction is very legal worldwide. We can see the worldwide legally, but the very gray transaction, so that it's very difficult to show to get the evidence of the illegalness. So, but Indonesia got three groups, major groups for this goreng saham. I'd like to show, but I would like to show, but there's no time to show each case. But here, the Uni Resources Shares case and solo groups for mafia pasar modal. Let me wrap up shortly. So please go to the 41, please. Yeah, IMF have IMF have studied that there has been some lack of governance and fragile legal framework in the stock market, so that since the Asian crisis, they tightened the regulations in order to secure foreign investors' interests. However, the regulators' weakness, got all the weakness on exposure of non-transparent activities, so that the political interferences and inner circle play activities have occurred, which promoted non-transparency in the market. Meanwhile, insider trading engaged by the stock exchange, so some political structures as regulators were involved in saham goreng. That hindering the effectivity of sanctions, charging non-transparency in the market as a whole. And what I'm going to mention is that LPA have been the weaker capacity than those collaborative partnership alliances in stock market. So that undermines the governance of the stock market, which led to underdevelopment. So next issue is for me is how about current OJK? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kadishi. We go to the second session right now, and we have still 20-25 minutes remaining for the second session. I invite you for the 3 questions first. 3 questions, okay? Okay, exactly 3. Committee for... Please mention your name and to whom your question.
Thank you. My name is Irawan Jati from Universitas Islam Indonesia. I would like to address my questions firstly to Professor Meredith, if it is okay. You are comparing politically and generally with Indonesia and Malaysia. And my question actually is not related to politics. If you look at the comparison with the economic development with Indonesia and Malaysia, Indonesia of course far behind Malaysia's development. The basic question is what makes different between Indonesia and Malaysia's policy in terms of economy. Why Indonesia is not capable enough to go on with Malaysia, for example, and we are so far behind from Singapore, the nation which has no natural resources, but be able to be the top of 7 or 8 richest country of the world. That's my question for Professor Meredith. And my second question goes to Professor Adam. You mentioned our palm oil production condition. As far as I'm concerned, the government is still very reliant on this our palm oil industry, because it has been able to fill the gap of our trade balance. What I mean is the deficit of trade balance with Indonesia and East Asian countries, with Japan, China, and Southeast Asia. Because we have a huge export of CPO, for example, to Pakistan, which can cover this deficit. And my question is, how do you think that in practical, how do you think that the government should balance the policy of still reaching this economic growth, but still, concern the environment to reach the SDGs objective? Thank you very much.
Next.
Thank you. My name is Fahmi. I want to ask a question about the palm oil from Universitas Indonesia. I'm coming from Rokan Hilir, Riau. Yeah. And my father's working in the palm oil sector, and my father's growing me by the income in the palm oil sector, and many people in the Sumatra, of course, many people in Sumatra get the income from the palm oil sector, and in my opinion, it can be reduce the poverty, of course, and other social issues. On the other hand, the global institution want to reduce the production of the palm oil because it may cause the harmful for the environment. So, in my opinion, I just want to know what do you think about this issue? In the one hand, maybe it is the issue is about the harmful for environment. But the other hand, Indonesia still need the palm oil to grow, to reduce poverty and other social issues. So that's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay, the first thing that my name is Muhammad Rizal Patari. I'm from Universitas Jakarta. But actually, I have a vital question that goes to for all the speakers here, and I think that presenting several research studies regarding the economic policy, as well as the policy making and other things, that we have to know that this is one of the vital challenges on distribution area. It reminds me how, and I was thinking about how to enforce cross-border cases in ASEAN, because of ASEAN member states have lots of differences in other sectors like the legal systems, policy making, as well as the economic policy itself. And I was thinking about how the government can be tackled if there is something, the plethora of the cross-border in ASEAN, because of ASEAN has been implementing throughout 5 years ago, which means that we have all the economic sectors like the free flow investment, and also free flow goods and services and the capital market. It can be obtained effectively and easily. So my question is, how the government to enforce the cross-border cases, or it's called like an unfair business competition in ASEAN. So how the government can resolve the problem? Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, thank you. 3 person and 6, I think, questions. Yeah, and I start from Dr. Kodishi first. Yeah, to answer the questions, and then continue with Dr. Tyson and Dr. Ruiz.
yeah, the question is how to solve the common issues in Southeast Asian nations, right? Actually, my topic is about the stock market in Indonesia, but actually there are some problem such as which I showed as I showed for short selling or saham goreng. I think this is the problem of each market, so each can tackled but yeah stock market is under the supervision of each financial supervisors in each nation, so that if we but the money
in Indonesia, including of course INDEF, as well as from Indonesia's efforts to foster international academic research partnerships and centers of excellence across universities, which with substantive policy-relevant networks and outputs,
or Europe. So it is very the global issue. So that, but ASEAN can support. ASEAN can collaborate to tackle this issue or exchange the information about the capital flow. Where it's from, or how to tackle. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to keep it brief because actually the first question went to Meredith, but I'll blaze through these as fast as possible. The first was really directed to my colleague. Why is Indonesia so far behind? Nice and easy question, right? I do remember President Joko Widodo not too long ago giving a speech and saying, "Apa yang salah dengan kita?" And it was a speech that the cabinet secretary's website refused to publish, by the way, but it was a good speech. And he compares Indonesia to Malaysia, and especially South Korea. That's his big fixation. And so, yeah, why is Indonesia behind? And that's a complex one, okay? And I'll kind of just leave that alone for now, but I do appreciate the way in which your president posed that question. Not very politically correct. The other is, ada banyak anak kepala kelapa sawit. And look, I've been around Riau. I've been to, of course, Pekanbaru and Kampar and Siak and Teluk Meranti and Bengkalis, and you go to Tesunilo, and you're all around, and you see many, many different stories, many of which are stories of prosperity. And I definitely do not deny that. Okay, and I accept the economic rationale for poverty alleviation, for this as a generator of income and employment. There's no way you can deny that. My point is the story is actually one of differentials. You can see great prosperity in Kecamatan A and Kecamatan B, maybe a very different story. So I just appeal to people to avoid those overly generalized statements about this being simply a success story. It is partially that, but I would argue that the flip side is, and the reason why there's so much EU normative pressure, for example, is Riau is also a province, as you well know, filled with irregularities, incomplete spatial planning, overlapping land claims, not very good AMDAL, not necessarily very clear future planning for where expansion should take place, quite low efficiencies in some areas where you could have higher yields. Crime and corruption is very big still in Riau. You've had many governors go down over the last decade. And so my point is it can be so much better, all right? If you look at Riau for 20 years, you have forever changed your landscape, forever. But it could have been done better. And if we're forecasting ahead to 2045, it can still be done better. So I'm not denying the prosperity, I'm saying there could be so much improvement still, and this comes through good planning, good policy, good transparency, and a serious public discourse about where Riau is going. And if you look at Sabah Sarawak, they're saying palm oil is the savior crop. And I would say, yeah, go have a look in Riau first, because this is what it's going to look like in 20 years, all right? And I love Riau, but there are many, many problems there, okay? So it's just a reality check, in my view. And lastly, very, very quickly, ASEAN, I always defer to my colleagues on this. I have Helena Varkey, my co-author, who fields all of these questions. But really, for me, it's about transboundary haze management and Malaysia's 50% forest pledge, which means Malaysian companies expand in Indonesia instead and deforest here rather than there. Okay, thanks.
The question, the very difficult question of why Indonesia lags Malaysia or Singapore in economic development, or why Malaysia lags Singapore in economic development. Depending on where your starting point is, you can carry this chain all the way down. Why does Burma and Myanmar lag everybody? But so there are all sorts of reasons. The earlier, in the 1960s, the development of these political culture models, people like Lucian Pai and Samuel Flint and others would point to places like South Korea and Thailand and Burma and say, look, the end of World War II, all of these countries were on the same plane. They had similar resource endowments, they had a similar standard of living, and yet within just a matter of a couple of decades, they start really to diverge. And what explains that? So some of those early takes look at political culture and say it's something about the culture within which politics happens. I don't discount that, but I think we can take a broader lens and say a key reason is really politics. And that's not just to say contemporary decision making, but the starting points at different political moments leave us on the paths on which countries become dependent. So Malaysia and Singapore, one really simple starting point. None of these factors is solely explanatory, right? They all work in tandem. But Malaysia and Singapore were both governed by the British, who left without a war, who left infrastructure in place, who trained administrators, who kept their own large economic stake, which they maintained in Singapore continually. In Malaysia, only scaled back with some limited nationalization with the start of the new economic policy in the 1970s, but really didn't leave. So you had a much less tumultuous transition from colonialism, and you had already a high level of development. So this year, in 2019, is the 200th anniversary of Singapore's Raffles Landing, the sort of start of British colonialism within Singapore. And you hear a lot, because it's also the start of election season in Singapore. There will be an election in Singapore very soon. The PAP wants to burnish its record. So we saw this when the last election, which was 50 years since separation from Malaysia. The PAP will have its record, what they say is like from mud flats to metropolis, or all sorts of. We were nothing when the British left. We were just dirt and all of that. That is not true. The British helped to divert shipping routes and to do other things that really made Singapore already a financial shipping and trading hub, even though it does not itself have its resources. And so some of that really shapes that ongoing trajectory. Beyond that, you've had Singapore and Malaysia are highly urbanized. Malaysia is over 70% urban now, right? So even despite the political discourse of the Bumi Putra community as being rural, that's not true. Malays are actually 70% urban in Malaysia. So a lot of people vote in a rural area, but they live and work in the Klang Valley or somewhere else, right? And so that also shapes the nature of decision making and trade-offs. All of that stuff I was saying about the questions of political sustainability and of catering to different audiences, of making sure that different constituencies' interests are heard and upheld. That's a lot simpler when you're Singapore and 100% is set, well, like 98% urban at this point, right? And when a huge proportion of your population in Singapore, around a quarter, are not citizens and cannot vote, have no say. And so in that sense, it makes for an easier process of supposedly technocratic decisions. So I think all of that really matters. Indonesia is a large, complex place with really different economic needs, with, yes, high inequality, but less severe inequality than Malaysia or Singapore. And so all of that really matters a lot. In addition, we have things like the prioritization given to education and the type of education. So I've done a lot of research in the past on higher education development in Malaysia, some regionally as well. The question of what language education is in. We balance in deciding that goals of nationalism and identity building and national pride with goals of technological and economic compatibility with the rest of the world. So is your goal to be a great place for multinational corporations to come because everyone speaks English? Or is it to be a place that has a clear sense of national identity? And how do you balance this? Malaysia's still working that out. Should the STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and math, clearly I'm not STEM, should those be in English because it's the universal language of numbers, right? But it's a difficult thing. And I think Indonesia and Malaysia share some of those dilemmas, but Malaysia has perhaps leaned more toward capitalizing on an earlier advantage in English, for instance, and with multinational links to try to develop, and also has not had quite the same level of, number one, post-colonial mismanagement. So I think even though the Suharto years, this was the new order of Baru, was a tremendous period of developmental statehood, there was also a limit to how far that spread, right? And how deeply governance penetrated in different ways. So when you relax those controls, then we have a real problem of learning, of how to proceed along a democratic mode of economic development. Malaysia hasn't had yet democratization now, but the transition in Malaysia is a dramatically different thing from the transition in Indonesia. We haven't had the same role, for instance, in military and politics. How do we then rationalize that in terms of economic control or economic interests? So basically, lots of factors, no clear answers, but I think there are real ways in which size, urbanization, and past histories, political and political-cultural histories, really simplify some of the difficult decisions that a state has to make. In terms of cross-border collaboration, I'm also not an expert on ASEAN, but I will say that you referenced the ASEAN economic community and these sorts of standardizations that are supposed to happen. I think that's probably the single most promising aspect. So standardizing accounting practices across borders, that's useful. I think there are risks there, which is that Singapore and often Malaysian multinationals tend to be the ones to go forth and develop the lesser developed countries of ASEAN. That's useful. It's not neo-colonial or post-colonial in quite the same way as having it be the US or Europe or whatever else. But at the same time, it's still an internal domination, right? So it still may favor the corporate interests of Malaysian and Singaporean investors, for instance, above what Lao citizens perhaps desire or what Myanmar citizens desire. So that's why you see lots and lots of hotels being built and lots of corporate offices and so forth, rather than perhaps upgrading rural smallholder infrastructure. So those are real challenges, or the prioritization of private interests above public goals, in as much as we pursue joint ventures or private capital as leading the way toward development. There are good reasons to do that. States that lack resources, lack capacity, lack capital can find these willing partners, but those willing partners have different objectives and may not be subject to the same sorts of mechanisms for accountability and transparency as if these were public decision-making, public investments. So it's all to say that standardization of accounting practices, standardization of some of the real mechanics of trade across borders could go a long way. Finding out what language could be a lingua franca in a more useful way for ASEAN besides English might also help. But it's still to say that you're still talking about trying to harmonize across really different countries that are more disparate in terms of economic development and current goals than the countries of Western Europe, certainly, or even Central and Eastern Europe, I would argue.
Thank you. Give for speakers. Okay, we are running out of time right now, and yeah, we should end the session
this time. So thank you for your participation and for the speakers, for the discussion, for all of you here actively participated in this discussion, and hopefully that this discussion will give you an insight and give you a question, a new question to be thought that perhaps that can give a solution for our lovely nation. So thank you very much, Dr. Weiss, Dr. Tyson, Dr. Konisi, and I give this time to MC, Master Chairman.
Thank you very much, sir. Okay, people close for us. Thank you. Before we close the discussions, please for all the speakers stay on the stage because there will be a souvenir from them. And the souvenir will be given by Rabini, Professor Gigi Jiran. Please welcome. Thank you very much. From the speaker, moderator, and professor, please may return to your seat. Okay, thank you very much for the speakers and moderator for valuable knowledge. Make it useful for all us. For the next panel discussion, the second one, it will be start at 3:30 p.m. at the same place, Aula Nurholis Majid. And now, the attendees, please, good lunch.